Chapter 19 is on our federal fair housing laws, or it's our fair housing chapter for this textbook. It's a very important chapter for you to pay close attention to. Number one, there's a good number of questions that you'll see on the exam found in this chapter, and there's 2 pages at least in this book. They just are a great reference and study aid. Okay, so I'll point those out when we get to that. Secondly, the other important reason for understanding fair housing laws is to help you pass the simulation exam. The simulation exam is that situational ethics test that you'll have to take once you complete the course through ProEd. And it is this ethics simulator. You get kind of put in this situation or this scenario, and then you're asked, what do you do? How do you get out of it? Or what have you. And so understanding fair housing laws is going to be a huge help to helping you through that simulation. And then number 3, which I personally feel is the most important, if you want to keep your license for any length of time, you need to make sure you understand how to avoid getting in trouble with these fair housing laws. So to start off, let's look at the origination of these fair housing laws, where it all began, and what they look like in our world today. Fair housing laws, these are federal and state and local laws that provide equal opportunity in housing. The sale and rental of any residential or vacant land for sale for residential construction use are all going to have to abide or follow these fair housing laws. Fair housing. So, commercial, like this office space that I currently lease, they don't have to abide by fair housing laws. Now, I say that, but there is some Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA laws, that they have to comply with because they have to make this space open for everybody's enjoyment or use. Okay? So there are some exceptions, but for your test, I want you to remember that these are fair housing laws. They apply to housing. So if a farmer is selling off 160 acres of crop ground to another farmer that's buying it for crop ground, we're not going to be looking at fair housing laws. We're looking at them when we're talking about the sale and rental of residential and vacant land that's for sale for the purpose of residential construction. Now, as we continue on, I want to point out our first Fair Housing Act, or law that came into place that was promoting fair housing. This came about in 1866. You'll have a separate handout that I'd like for you to look at as well. And this is a really good chart that goes through and tells you on the far left column the legislation, or I should say the different protected classes, and then it tells you the different laws that went into place and then who was protected through those laws. And so get this out along with your handout as we go through this chapter. It's going to be a really good tool to help you with it. Okay? So in 1866, the Civil Rights Act was passed. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which that's what it will be referred to on your test as, that was passed. And it protected one class and one class only, and that was race. Prohibits discrimination based on race. Now, President Lincoln had originally got the ball rolling and was in the process of putting this into place, and then he was assassinated. So his predecessor finished this out, and this became a law in 1866. And if I move on, we have a little blurb in the book, because I'm going in progressive order from page to page. We see a little description on HUD. HUD is who hears the complaints that are filed against different businesses or entities or people regarding these fair housing laws. And HUD is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, provides funds for homeowners, for low-income citizens, and low-rent public housing. And so if you've ever heard of Section 8 housing, that's for low-income families. They have to meet certain standards. And then you, as the landlord or owner that is renting out property that qualifies or falls under Section 8, you're going to have to meet certain standards as well. And that's one of the government programs through HUD. You won't have to remember Section 8 for your exam, okay? So Jones versus Mayer is next, and you don't see this on this chart here, but you will see the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So this can be a little bit confusing because this Jones versus Mayer case was heard before the Supreme Court and given a ruling in 1968. Jones versus Mayer was where a black man was trying to purchase a lot. I believe it was in Missouri, and he was denied that because of his race. And so what happened was it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court went back to the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and says, never can you discriminate when it comes to housing based on race. And so that was upheld, and he came out victorious. So race can never be a part of any real estate transaction. And then in 1968 was created the Federal Fair Housing Act. You'll see that on this page as well, the Fair Housing Act. It says FH Act 1968. You'll see that column. And you'll see that it has 4 classes of people that are protected. And this came about, like I said, in 1968. We have race, color, religion, and national origin. So race, color, religion, national origin. National origin is simply where a person is from. Okay? Somebody coming over on the boat from Ireland or Germany or Africa or Australia. It's where somebody's from. Remember back to history in high school or college, what was going on in 1968? What was going on in 1866? In 1974? In 1988? I mentioned 74 and 88 because you're going to see that we have a couple amendments or additions to this Fair Housing Act of 1968 in which those years have added those classes. So on the slide, you'll see that in 1974, gender was added, or we could say sex. And if you again go back to this sheet, you'll see that sex is in the column, or checked, or X'd, I should say, where you see H and C Development Act 1974. So that's the amendment, 1974. If I keep going on this sheet, and I'll see FH amend or amendment of 1988. And we have disability and familial status. So those are the 2 that were added in 1988 under President Reagan. In 1974, sex was added. So what I'd like for you to do on this sheet, and however it makes sense for you, is somehow draw a line connecting FH Act 1968, or the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and connect it to the H&C DeVal Act 1974 and the FH Amend 1988. So the 74 and 88 amendments, I want you to connect that to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Because that will give us 7 total classes. I know some of the X's may cause some confusion, but it gives us 7 total classes, and you should be able to see that on this sheet. We're going to have race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, and familial status. And those 7 classes are the classes that are protected under the Fair Housing Act. So you may have to remember the year, like the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. You may have to remember those years. But what you will have to remember is that amendment in 1974, which added sex, and in 1988, which added familial status and disability. Those are lumped into the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So when you see on a test question they ask about the Fair Housing Laws or the Fair Housing Act or even the Fair Housing Act of 1968, even though it's not technically part of 1968, you're going to include all three of those, which total 7 protected classes: race, color, religion, national origin, sex, handicap, and familial status. So all 7 classes are underneath our federal fair housing laws or the Fair Housing Act, or however they word it on the test. They're all included. And you will have to memorize those classes, okay, because you'll see it on a test. So if I want to spend a little bit more time on this sheet, you go to the next column that I haven't discussed yet, which is EC-OP Act 1974. That's the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or ECOA. It came about in 1974, and that applies to lenders, and it lists the protected classes there. You will need to know that list. If you want to reference that, go back to chapters 10 or 11, that video. It is mentioned in that video, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, okay? And so that should help us finish out the sheet. So chapter 19, continuing on, we see that the Amendment Act of 1988 prohibits discrimination based on disability and familial status. And familial status is families with children. And we're going to define that a little bit better here in just a few minutes. So while we're going through this, if you would get out your textbook, I want to direct your attention to a page or pages that are going to help you with study purposes. So if you open your book to page 376, that's kind of where all this begins, what we're going to go through next. 376, 377, and 378 are the ones that I'd like for you to pay close attention to. We're going to discuss them right now, and you'll have the slides that go with it. But again, looking at the book, maybe the format in which the book is written might help it make a little bit more sense as well. So you can put away this sheet, and then let's look at the handouts and the book. So at the bottom of page 376, we'll see that the Civil Rights Act of 1968 made it illegal or prohibited the following acts: refusing to sell, rent, or lease, or negotiate or deal with any person that's one of these protected classes. Quoting different terms or conditions to somebody that's one of the members of these protected classes. Number 3 is on the top of page 377. You'll see advertising to only certain races, colors, religions, or national origins. And so some of these, I think a lot of us have a pretty good understanding of racism, of discrimination, and what that looks like. And I think a lot of us, I'd say across the board, have a certain picture in mind, or pictures in mind, when I think about discrimination. Well, this one is maybe a little bit different. It is still discrimination, but it may not be the kind of discrimination that you would think of on an average or normal basis. So when we get to the simulation, you're going to see this one play out in one of our simulation questions. And here's the scenario. So let's say you have a Hispanic homeowner, and they're asking you to sell their house, and they only want you to advertise in the local Hispanic newspaper. Can you do that? And if I had a group of realtors here, there would be mixed opinions on that. If I look at this fair housing laws, it says I can't do that because I'm only advertising, or my advertising is only directed to the Hispanic community. That's discrimination. I can't do that. Now, if I advertise in the paper of general publication, so for Sioux Falls here we have the Argus Leader, which that's distributed to everybody, okay? Or everybody has equal access to it. It's directed to everybody in the city. If I advertise there first, then I can move on and advertise in the Hispanic newspaper if I wish, because I covered my bases. I had an inclusive advertisement with including everybody in the city with the Argus Leader, and then I have a little bit more exclusive advertising when I use the local Hispanic newspaper to advertise my seller's house. So that's acceptable, and you'll see that emphasized as we go through that simulation practice. Number 4 is steering, 5 is blockbusting, and 6 is redlining. It may not say that specifically, but the descriptions of these are talking about those things. So I'm going to draw for you what this looks like and explain it to you. Okay. So I have steering, blockbusting, and redlining up here on the board. I have these squares above them, and these are representing my communities or neighborhoods. And so remember, we're talking about these 7 protected classes. So keep that in mind as we go through this. And I'm not going to pick out the more obvious protected classes. I'm just going to do some more bizarre, I guess you could say, ones. And they have to deal with my background, so I'm not being prejudiced because I'm talking about my background. Because this first one in steering is where we are deliberately trying to get somebody to move into a particular neighborhood. Every time they jump in our car to go look at houses, we're driving them right into this neighborhood. And let's say that I have a Lutheran buyer. When I was younger, I grew up in the Lutheran church. So again, I'm not being prejudiced. But this neighborhood is all full of Lutherans. That's religion, right? That's a protected class. So I'm constantly driving this buyer into this Lutheran neighborhood, even though they don't like any of the houses, and the houses that are for sale do not meet their criteria. I'm constantly steering them into that neighborhood. And so we're talking about protected classes, and we're steering them into certain neighborhoods. The next one would be blockbusting. Blockbusting, just to help you out, is going to be pretty much opposite of steering. Instead of driving people in to a protected neighborhood, we're using what's called panic selling or panic peddling, and not pedaling like we pedal a bicycle, but peddling like we peddle our wares or something along those lines. But you could see panic selling and panic peddling on a test, and it's describing every time blockbusting. And blockbusting is profiting, as you can see on your slide, from inducing or influencing owners to sell or rent because minorities are moving into a neighborhood. And I know it says minorities, and typically we associate that with maybe race or color, but that's not what it's not just minorities, okay? This is any and all protected classes that we're dealing with. So I'm going into this neighborhood, and I'm telling everybody, look, the Dutch are moving in, and if you don't sell now, your home prices are going to plummet, because you know what happens when the Dutch move into these neighborhoods. Okay? So you're having people move out through this panic selling because of a particular protected class moving in. And then finally, we have redlining. And on the slide it says that we are discriminating in home loans or lenders refusing to make mortgage loans to specific neighborhoods. And so this one deals with lenders. This is not something that would deal with us as real estate agents, but it would deal with lenders. They're refusing to make loans to certain areas, so they would pick a certain spot in the city and say, no loans for you. Or in South Dakota, they could, for instance, draw out or locate the boundaries of the Indian reservation and say anybody within the boundaries of the reservation, we're not going to do loans to. They can't do that. That's discrimination. As if you look at ECOA, which we referenced before and back in chapter 10 and 11, if a borrower meets certain standards or meets the standards that's prescribed, the bank has to give them a loan. It doesn't matter about their race, color, religion, sex, handicap, national origin, or familial status. None of that matters, which it shouldn't. So moving on, we look at number 7, discriminating in real estate services, multiple listing services, or broker organizations. We cannot ever discriminate or be a party to discrimination, and we'll see that on the day that we look at the Code of Ethics in class. 8, charge higher security deposits to the handicapped or families with children. 9, segregation to particular areas of a building. Let's say you have an apartment complex with buildings located around it. I can't send all of my single moms and dads to this building, all of my retirees to this building, all of my families to this building, all of my singles here, and all of my German residents there. Can't do that. Also part German. So I can't segregate. Can't discriminate. If I have an opening, then first come, first serve. Number 10, denying services and amenities. For instance, if you put a gym on the second floor of a building, you would have to make it handicap accessible. So let's look at a building here. If I'm renovating this building downtown and I'm going to make it into apartments, and I'm really a health nut, I want to have a gym made available to all the tenants that are going to be leasing in this space. If I decided to put the gym on that second floor, I certainly could, but I'd have to make it accessible by the other tenants. And so I could not say that if you're in a wheelchair you can't lease here because I don't have access to the gym. I have to provide access for wheelchaired people. I have to make, if I have a person in a wheelchair, I have some ground level units that are available. If I wanted to put the gym on the second floor, like I said, I could, but I'd have to install either a lift system or an elevator system so that those who are handicapped, those who are in a wheelchair, can access the gym and use it. There are some exceptions on page 377, and these are ones that you need to pay close attention to, okay? Because these exceptions, such as where we have somebody that owns three or fewer single-family residences, or an owner-occupied fourplex, or a building that's designated to house the elderly, you're going to see at least 2, maybe 3 questions on your exam about these exceptions. So please pay attention. So you can discriminate as a homeowner, not using the services of a broker. You'll see that in the bullet points. If you own 3 or fewer single-family residences, if you haven't sold a single-family residence in the last 2 years, you cannot discriminate in your advertising ever. And if I would keep reading on, well, it's maybe not included in this list, but what I want to point out is you can never, ever, ever discriminate based on race, okay? So you may be able to discriminate on the fact that they're a Lutheran or that they're Dutch, but you cannot ever discriminate based on race, even if you meet these requirements. That is never an exception, okay? And then finally, we have an owner-occupied fourplex. So, an owner-occupied fourplex would look something like this. I have a 4-unit building, and I, as the owner, I occupy that unit. And the other 3 units, I can discriminate. I can say who is going to live there and who won't. Now in South Dakota, which I don't think you'll see on a test, but you will see this one on a test, is it's an owner-occupied duplex. If the owner occupies this unit, they can discriminate in who goes in the second unit. Okay? And that's South Dakota law. National exam is what you're going to need to know, and that's an owner-occupied fourplex. Also, church-owned properties. Lutheran Social Services. They own some properties, let's say, around town, and they can discriminate. They can say only Lutherans can lease these units from us. And the reason they can do that is because they don't discriminate as to who can become a Lutheran. So they can lease as long as if they don't discriminate towards who can become a member of their church or civic group. Like, for instance, the Elks Club. The Elks Club, if they own some property, they can say only Elks members can lease these units as long as they don't discriminate as to who can become a member of the Elks Club. And then finally, we have age. There are 3 age exemptions discussed in your book. The first one is when somebody's going to use either federal or state funding to build a retirement type facility or a facility for people of a certain age group. This building is designed to be occupied by elderly people. If that's a state-assisted project or national-assisted project, then you can discriminate based on age. Number 2, if it's intended to be occupied by people that are 62 years of age and older, so nobody under 62 can live here. And then finally, number 3 is it's intended for somebody to occupy that's 55 years of age and older. At least one of the occupants have to be that. So number 3 is intended for at least one person 55 years of age per unit. So if I'm, let's say, 39 and I'm married to a 57-year-old, we could live there because she's 57, so she's over the age of 55, even though I'm under 40. Now, there's a bullet point under here that I want you to pay close attention to because you could see that on a test. And it does state that persons with disabilities. That's the next slide. When you think of disabilities, a lot of times people will just think of the more obvious ones, I guess, for lack of better words. So we think of somebody that's maybe in a wheelchair, somebody that is blind, or maybe they're deaf, somebody that is mentally disabled. A lot of times that's where our mind goes when we think of disabilities. But as defined by the law, a disability is anybody who has an impairment of a major life function. You might see a test question that says, if you had somebody that was applying to live in one of your units that you're currently leasing and they had AIDS, could you discriminate against them? And you can't, because that's going to fall underneath a disability. Somebody that's an alcoholic, that's also considered a disability. Somebody that suffers from bipolar or depression, disability. Whether or not we agree with it, it's going to fall into that category of disability, and we have to follow the fair housing laws when it comes to meeting their needs. There are some exclusions. If somebody has been convicted of or manufacturers are distributing illegal drugs, then we could discriminate against them. Also, somebody who poses a risk to the health and safety of others. So if you have a large apartment complex like this one I have up here on the board, and you have somebody who has like violent schizophrenia, you can say no, because you have all types of people that live here, and you don't want anybody to be harmed potentially. So these people with disabilities cannot be charged a higher security deposit. So if you have somebody who's confined to a wheelchair, you can't say, well, I'm going to need an extra $500 from you for a carpet allowance because this wheelchair is going to wear my carpet out quicker. You can't do that. Somebody who has to have a seeing-eye dog because they're blind, you can't charge them a pet deposit because they have to have that dog as a part of them functioning in life. One test question that I'm almost certain you'll see is it talks about these modifications. Now, a tenant can make reasonable modifications at their own expense, but they may be required to restore it back to the original condition. So you'll have scenarios where a tenant wants to put in a ramp because they're in a wheelchair, or they want to put in grab bars in the bathroom, or they want to widen the doorways or lower the cupboards. They can do all that. They can do it at their own expense, but they can do that. And then they have to restore it back to the condition it was found in once they vacate. Now, in the real world, some of those probably would just be left the way they are. For instance, installing grab bars in the bathroom, it's fine and dandy to leave those. So those probably would be left if the tenant widened all the doorways. It's not too difficult to widen the doorways. You just get the Sawzall out and cut the size you need and put the door back and do some touch-up painting and you're done. But trying to restore that doorway back to the original size, that's going to take a lot more work. So many times the owners will just leave it as is. But things like a wooden ramp that's installed over the staircase to get in and out of the property, lowering of the cabinets or light switches, that's going to have to be restored back, and the tenant's going to be responsible to do that. If there are some very extensive modifications that are being done, the landlord can require that some funds from the tenant be put into a separate bank account or an escrow account, and then when the tenant vacates, if the tenant just up and leaves, now the landlord has money to put those back into the original condition that they were in. Families with children or familial status. This is anybody with kids under the age of 18. That's pretty much self-explanatory. But this families with kids or kids under the age of 18 is a little bit broader. If we have somebody that has, number one, the legal guardianship over somebody that's 16, even though they're not the biological parent or a foster parent, they would be protected in this familial status. Secondly, if we have somebody in the process of getting custody or adopting children. My cousins adopted 3 kids from the Ukraine, and it wasn't just an overnight deal where they called up Russia and said, or the Ukraine said, hey, send me 3 kids, and they overnighted them in a crate. That's not how it happens. It's a long, drawn-out process. And so it took them roughly about a year to get the kids over here. From the visits that they had to make over to the Ukraine, all the paperwork, the processing, finally everything came together and they had the kids. But again, it was a long process. Even though they're in the process and the kids aren't physically here, they would still be classified a family with children. And then finally, a pregnant mom. She's pregnant. The baby physically isn't here yet, but it is inside her tummy. So those 9 months, she would be considered a protected class for families with children. And of course, after the baby's born, she would be as well. The next slide you'll see is ECOA. We see that, we see the protected classes that are listed on that fair housing sheet that we went through earlier, so you have that. It does say that the credit application must be based on the credit rating, job stability, income basis, and net worth. That's what a lender is looking at. So again, it doesn't matter what class of people they are, as long as they meet the certain guidelines, they have the credit score where it should be, they have the right debt to income ratios, and so on, they're going to get a loan. Article 10 of the Code of Ethics, which we'll look at, like I mentioned earlier when we get to the Code of Ethics, says that realtors shall not deny equal professional service to those protected classes, and they will not be a party or plan to discriminate. So we can't discriminate ourselves as a realtor, but we can't be a party to discrimination. So we can't say, well, I'm not discriminating, but my seller is. My seller says they're not going to sell their house to anybody that's Mexican. I'm not the one being racist, it's my seller. Well, it doesn't matter. You can't be a party to that discrimination, okay? As a member of the realtor organization. Now, I may have said this earlier, but I'll say it again. What you're taking this class for is to get your real estate license, and once you have this South Dakota real estate license, you can sell anywhere in the state of South Dakota. Chances are, though, if you join the local board, so you can be a part of the MLS and put your houses on MLS and help buyers buy houses that are listed on MLS, you're going to become a member of the National Association of Realtors, as well as the local or state level Association of Realtors. And when you become a member of that organization, you get to use the trademark name Realtor in describing who you are, but you also are obligating yourself to follow the Code of Ethics. And the Code of Ethics, Article 10, what I just read, says that we won't be a party to discrimination or discriminate ourselves. Equal housing opportunity poster, you'll see the house with the equal sign in it. That has to be displayed prominently in every office. It says that we do business according to the federal fair housing law, and it's illegal to discriminate against those 7 protected classes that we've already looked at. Any of your print advertising, finally, needs to have this logo with it. So your flyers, posters, brochures, business cards, they need to have this logo. The exception is in the classifieds. If you look in your local classified newspaper where all the houses that are listed for sale are by other realtors, or if you look in like a Homeview magazine that's just full of houses that are for sale, you're not going to see that little house with the equal sign logo on every single ad. And that's because either the local newspaper or the magazine takes care of that through some kind of disclaimer or some kind of verbiage before or after the advertisement that will qualify underneath this equal housing opportunity requirement. So they're going to take care of it for you so you don't have to put it in every single advertisement. And so, again, on all your printed advertising, you need to have this. And we had a gal in class one time that she had her house on the market at the same time that she was attending class. And one day she brought in all the business cards that the agents have left at her house when they showed the house to prospective buyers. And I think she had about 20 cards, and only half of them had that equal housing opportunity logo on it. The other half did not. I would strongly encourage you to check with your broker, but it is a requirement. Whether or not other agents follow it, that's between them and the law. But I'm just giving you the heads up so you understand that, and you may see it on your test as well.